In the run-up to the next major, the League Major Boston 2018, we've seen a lot of discussions surrounding Boltz and how he won't be able to participate in this next major because of the sort of pseudo roster lock created by the rule set and the circumstances surrounding the major system. And there's this phrase that comes up, or that has been coming up a good bit, where people want to say, either because they're a SK Gaming fan or because they just want the best team in the world to attend, they're just a big fan of strong Counter-Strike, they want to say, if you don't allow SK to play with Boltz, there will be an asterisk on this major. And this phrase, I think, this idea doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, and I wanted to cover this in the video because I think this idea, first, it's a little silly because, yeah, it's not like SK have to play with a really terrible player, their coach or something. They're going to be able to play with Phelps, who was on their team. They had a lot of success with Phelps in the summer 2017, and you know, yeah, they did taper off the end with Phelps, but generally, yeah, Phelps is a stronger player individually. Maybe doesn't work as well with the team, but yeah, no, it doesn't seem to be as dramatic a problem as I think people are making it out to be. But I also don't think it's as dramatic a problem in context with history, that if you go through all the past majors, as I plan on doing in this video, that you'll see a lot of scenarios where there are problems with the Valve Major, with the tournament, that prevents it from being as effective as a measuring tool for the best teams in the world as it could be. You know, there are some very serious issues with many majors. I think I counted 5 before the start of this video, such majors where I think there's problems that are equal to or exceed by a good margin, by in some cases a very wide margin, the issue with SK not having Boltz. So in this video, I just want to go ahead and run through these, and at the very end talk about what constitutes an asterisk. But before I do that, I want to just say that me personally, I'm someone who started writing about Counter-Strike in 2016. I really started to follow it, I think, in a very intense level, very serious level at the start of 2016, but I haven't always followed Counter-Strike with that same level of intensity. I would say I was a pretty casual fan in 2014, a more regular fan in 2015, more regular viewer, and then, yeah, so because of that, I'm not entirely sure I'll be able to capture the context and the history of all these events perfectly. So if I make a mistake, that's why. Feel free to point it out to me in the comments section. But going back to the very first Valve Major, DreamHack Winter 2013, I didn't see, when I look back at it, any super glaring issues with the event. ESL Major Series 1 Katowice, or the EMS 1 Katowice Major, didn't seem to have any glaring issues with it. The first major where I thought there was a really significant problem was ESL 1 Cologne 2014. And the problem with this event is that famously the map pool was changed in a very dramatic way prior to the start of the event. ESL 1 Cologne 2014 started August 14th, and this change to the map pool actually happened on July 2nd, and it was confirmed that the map pool would carry on into the major. You know, it was the change to the map pool for like the casual scene, or for you know, just online for the general player base, but it was confirmed to be in the major about a week later. So they didn't have very much time to accept these changes, and these changes to the map pool were extraordinarily dramatic. It wasn't like something that we might think of as being very dramatic right now, like say if Dust 2 was added in place of Nuke, as I suggested in my past article. But it was actually, there was a 1-for-1 change in that Train was removed and Cash was added, but there was also this additional change where the map pool got expanded from 5 to 7, with Cobblestone and Overpass being added to the list. And you remember at this time, Cobblestone was a much different map. The being bomb site was very different, and this was a very heavily criticized map at the time. A lot of people didn't want to play it. They thought it was sort of like a joke of a map, and the fact that this was going to be added into the map pool and aside of many best of threes at the major, or even best of ones, was seen as being ridiculous, as being extremely problematic, which I think is fair. I mean, think about if there was a 4-map swap right now going to this major, that say 2 maps were added and there was a 1-for-1 swap, or say like a different scenario where 3 maps were removed and 1 was added, or just a 2-for-2 trade or something like this. This would have really, really dramatic implications for this next E-League major. No, this was extremely disruptive, and I think is much more disruptive. It changes the results of that major much more than anything that the Boltz Phelps situation on SK could do right now. And there's also this other change which was less significant in comparison to this giant change to the map pool, but I think had a pretty big legacy, and a pretty negative legacy, which was that randomizers were added to best of ones and best of threes. So with the new best of one system with the 7-map pool, it worked like this. Instead of having 3 bans for each team and the 7th map for remainder, as we generally do today, is actually a change that we just very recently made to the Valve majors, but it's been more widely accepted by normal tournaments. But that's the 3 bans each system is generally what's used by everyone today. But what Valve wanted to do for the major was to prevent, say, one map from coming up over and over again, like Inferno. They added a randomizer, so each team only got 2 bans, and the last 3 maps were decided between with just a randomized element, which was, yeah, I think you can obviously, without going too much into detail on this topic, how that can be a very negative format, a very negative development in how the pick and ban phase is run. And the same thing was done with best of threes. Instead of having ban, pick, ban, 7th map remainder is played. If it has to be played, if it's not a 2-0. It was the same thing where it was like a ban, pick, and then the last 3 maps had to be decided between with a randomizer, which is, again, a very suboptimal format that stayed in place for a pretty unacceptably long period of time within the Valve majors. But yeah, these 2 changes to the format were, I mean, I think really, if you just look at the results and you look at the best of 3 series, had a pretty negative impact on the results of this tournament. The tournament wasn't able to best do its job in determining who was the best team in the world. I think that you can easily say that about ESL 1 Cologne 2014. And then the next Valve major, I think, is probably, in many people's mind, the most disrupted major by external forces. That was the most flawed major, the one that most people would want to put an asterisk next to. And this is DreamHack Winter 2014, because there was the issue with the cheating accusations and the actual cheating bans going into the major. So about a month before the major, you see Titan losing their spot because Kaylee got that VAC banned, and that sort of changed things around where they didn't have enough players from the old roster. They had like 3 out of 5 from the LDLC roster previously, and losing Kaylee meant they only had 2 out of 5, so they lost their spot. Epsilon, similar situation with SF, and yeah, that caused both teams to not be able to play at the major itself. So the composition of the teams at the major actually was changed by this, in addition to teams not having players on them, just like the Boltz situation. So this it's not like this would be like if SK lost Boltz and wasn't allowed to play at the major. Now it's not that extreme because it's not that extreme in a certain sense, because these teams were not as good as SK is now. They weren't the best teams in the world at the time, obviously. But yeah, I mean, this is a pretty dramatic change. And then the other big thing from this event is the famous Olaf Meisterboost, which I'm not going to go into because everyone, I think, knows the general story, and there's a lot of nuance and detail. There's people like Thorin and the on fire guys have covered in that documentary, I believe. So yeah, I think yeah, this major was a lot of fun, and I guess I should just point out with the LDLC Fnatic quarterfinal boostgate sort of issue is that those teams were the best teams in the world at the time, or seen as the top two teams in the world at the time. So that having one forfeit was a pretty huge deal. I think this is like having SK forfeit would be a huge deal, but they're not. They just have to replace a player with a player of sort of a comparable skill level or a similar level of effectiveness for the team. So yeah, I think this event is vastly overrates the disruption of just having SK with Boltz or Phelps instead of Boltz. But going to the next tournaments, the next group of 3 tournaments, I don't think the 2015 Valve Majors didn't have that much that stood out to me as being especially problematic. So there's some formatting changes were interesting, and ideally, if you want, I've said this before when talking about rating systems, that there's this principle that even though a rating system is flawed, if you have the same rating system, a consistent measuring stick throughout time, it actually has a better effect. That's not saying that these tournaments shouldn't fix problems. They should. It's just it actually creates like this imbalance, this discontinuity in history, like I was talking about in my last video, where the what you need to do to succeed at these events actually changes when the formatting changes. If you're going from group stage to Swiss, or from best of 1 to best of 3, and in ESL 1 Cologne 2015, you actually see this weird system added for just this one event where they have this sort of like 2-part group stage where it's still all best of 1s, but it's like a reseeding system where new groups are created by winners or losers from the original groups, which helped mitigate the sort of randomness element of the best of 1, or was supposed to mitigate this element. But in Inclusion of Poker, you actually see best of 3 show up in the group stages instead of just best of 1. So, I mean, you talk about some teams like famously the iBuyPower guys would complain that, okay, so all the group stages of the majors were best of 1s. That's their sort of famous failing point. And, existence from LDLC currently, Titan back then, had this reputation of failing at the majors, but those were best of 1s back then. People want to argue now maybe if he had best of 3s, that would be different. So there's these format changes. I'm not saying these are wholly negative. It just sort of changes the measuring stick a little bit. But yeah, I don't think you'd put an asterisk next to these events because these sort of much more minor formatting issues. And I think a lot of these are actually improvements, as I said before. But I think the next major that has a lot of problems is, of course, the MLG Columbus major, which was March 20th, March 15th, 2016. Somewhere around there. I don't have the exact date written down. But this event famously is where you have injuries to 2 players on 2 of the top teams. You got to remember in late 2015, early 2016, up to the MLG Columbus major, there's really 3 teams that stood out above all the rest in terms of the rankings, or just in terms of potency, in terms of results. You had Fnatic, who won 6 tournaments in a row. You have Navi, who's doing very, very well. And then you have Luminosity, who only seems to be able to lose to Fnatic and Navi. And even they're sort of going back and forth with Navi by the time they go to this tournament. These real teams, these 3, this trio that's standing out above all the other teams at this point. And then you have injuries on the leading 2 teams. I think most people would have Luminosity third going into that major. You have an injury on Fnatic and Navi. But it's not just like an injury where they lose a player. They lose like a player like Boltz, who's more of like a team player, more of a middling player for that team. They lose their star player, and these 2 players who they lose, lose to injury. They both play at this event, but they're obviously their skills very much constrained. Guardian, I think, famously had to use a very different, a much higher degree of sensitivity when he was injured. But yeah, it's Guardian and Olaf Meister, 2 players who were considered being the very best in the world or among the very best in the world at the time. Former number one players are considered to be number one players at some point. And contention for being the number one player in the world still with both of those guys. So those injuries were extremely impactful to the results of the events. Now, Navi still got to make the finals, but Guardian obviously wasn't in the same form. That's more of a testament to the skill of the rest of the Navi guys and the Navi system. But yeah, probably the third best team won that event, and you saw sort of Navi and Fnatic sort of fall short of what you think their level should have been or would have been if those injuries didn't happen. So yeah, that those sort of outside factors, it's not really anyone's fault that happened. It's not like Valve just fucking things up for no reason. It's just circumstance sort of hurt the impact, the legacy, the effectiveness of those tournaments to determine who was the best team of that era because of just outside factors of these injuries. But actually going forward, I guess I should have mentioned this to begin with MLG Columbus, but there's actually a major formatting change here as well that didn't actually attach to the major, but it was the addition of the minor into the major system, where the minors now, these regionalized minors are now being used to be offline qualifiers for the main offline qualifier, which is the main qualifier for the major. These are added, and this actually creates or majorly expands, I don't want to say majorly, maybe that's a bad word, but it dramatically expands this sort of pseudo roster lock issue that's become a sort of a feature of the modern CSGO landscape, because the minor adds another month and a half to the major system, and this creates this pseudo roster lock because the rules attached to who can move up and down between teams after someone's played in the minor or just the online qualifier for the minor, as I sort of covered in more detail in my last video. But that minor, because of the additions of that minor, I think you're going to see in the remaining tournaments that there's going to be an issue in almost every single tournament that's either somewhat caused or seems directly caused by this pseudo roster lock issue added by or increased in its intensity by the addition of the minors. So going into ESL 1 Cologne 2016, you see Zonic standing in for Dupree, which is something that's mentioned as sort of a counterpoint to this whole Boltz issue, that Astralis, not the best team in the world at the time. They actually just failed to get out of the group stage at ECS Season 1 prior to the ESL 1 Cologne 2016 major. They lost to TSM in a best of 1, and then Cloud9 in a best of 3 in that group at ECS Season 1, so that they got knocked out early, and that was sort of an embarrassing thing because, TSM, the North American team, wasn't seen as a super good team, and that Cloud9's another North American team, not a super strong team at the time. They actually lost to TSM, who were a bunch of nobodies at the time, in a best of 3 as well. So, Astralis, maybe not, definitely not the best team in the world, but Zonic standing in for them was, pretty big deal. But the other part of this, I think people maybe don't pay enough of attention to, is that when you talk about the roster lock, when Thorin did that Esports Salon episode with Flying DJ and Lurpus, the example that kept coming back to in a worst case scenario would be, what if Simple's team went out early in the major system and someone just loaned him. And they mentioned Simple because, Simple's one of the best players in the world. He has this really crazy, phenomenal skill level. Maybe not, maybe as much impact as the best players in the world, or maybe you think he has that impact. It's up for debate who's the best player in the world. But he's also a very self-sufficient player. He plays very aggressively, does a lot of things that some people might think are too aggressive without support from his teammates. But he's very independent in that sense, and he sort of can be plugged and played on any team. And this actually gets to this ESL 1 Cologne event in that Simple was sort of plugged and played onto Liquid, and Liquid made the finals of that tournament, right? Now, of course, it's not perfect. Simple didn't actually play in the minor in the CIS region after he left Liquid originally. He played in some tournaments after he left Liquid at first. after DreamHack Masters Malamo 2016. He left after some internal sort of issues. But he came back sort of like on loan, he was actually still, I think, contracted with Team Liquid this whole time, but he sort of just came back temporarily. He played ECS Season 1 finals, and then he played the major itself. So it really wasn't breaking the rules, but it was sort of this nightmare scenario that people are talking about where Simple comes in, boosts the team, and they do very well and disrupts the event as you would expect it to play out. So yeah, I think that's sort of almost like a nightmare scenario, the worst case scenario, and then happened, but no one wants. So I think this is way more significant. Both Dupree and Simple coming in and joining teams or playing when Ozonic for Dupree and Simple for Kusta, Kusta, I think, or maybe JDM replaced Kusta. I forget the exactly happened there. But yeah, that was obviously a hugely impactful. Those two substitutions were hugely impactful to ESL One Cologne 2016. And then going to the very next major, you see probably even more problems. Well, maybe not more problems. I think they manifested in a different way at the E-League major, the next major, E-League Atlanta 2017. So there's like sort of the normal problem where SK used Fox as a stand-in. FNX was removed after E-League Season 2. They used Fox for ECS Season 2 finals and, the E-League major. So SK have now, to the last 3 Valve majors, have had these sort of substitution issues. They just sort of had personality conflict, or they dropped a player at a sort of very suboptimal time. But yeah, SK used Fox for the event. SK weren't the best team in the world at the time. Maybe someone would say like top 4 when they still had FNX, maybe even top 3. But Optic were coming up at that time. FaZe were actually having some sort of low key good results, some top 4 at E-League Season 2 and ECS Season 2, if I remember correctly. So, but SK was still a pretty strong team, so using Fox is sort of noticeable. But the other thing that you got to notice for this event is that right after the event, lots and lots of teams changed their roster. And this is sort of the other side of the coin with the pseudo roster lock scenarios where teams actually stick together perhaps too longer than they would like because they don't want to have to use a stand-in for the major. So actually dead teams are going into the major, which some people would argue hurts the competitiveness of the tournament because maybe they don't practice it seriously because they know they're going to change players anyway. They just didn't do it beforehand because they want to have a decent chance for the major, or they don't want to have to change players but not be able to use those players and just use bad stand-ins for those players. So teams who change players after that major include Fnatic, G2, Envious, because Envious and G2 swap players. North and FaZe obviously swap players as well. They swapped AZ, so you saw changes there. Optic obviously lost Stanislaw. Fnatic and Godsent did swap. So there's a lot of changes at this time. Teams who don't change: Astralis, Verse Pro, Navi, but they changed the coach later. So very few of the top teams actually kept the same roster. So some people want to look back at that and say that hurt the integrity of the event, that these were all dead teams. So how competitive was this event really? Now, this is an event with another formatting change. You see the Swiss system being introduced to the majors, and Swiss system was used at both the E-League major and MLG, not the MLG, but the PGL major as well. This actually tournament, the MLG major, was actually the tournament that finally eliminated the randomizer from best of 3. So this terrible randomizer in the best of 3 has been there the whole time, which is it's sort of shocking to think about. But it's not until the PGL major where we actually see the, I think, best of 1 randomizer eliminated. But the PGL major, I think, was flawed in some other ways that doesn't necessarily have to do with roster changes. There wasn't like a big roster issue, I don't think, at PGL to talk about. But you do see the jump bug, which is a huge shocking point, which helped propel Big from getting to the playoffs. But as I've sort of argued in past articles, I think you really can't get too mad at them for that, because it means it's a bug that's available to anyone. Like, they're just using what was allowed, and they stopped using it when it was agreed upon to stop using it. But yeah, you could say that Big probably didn't deserve, quote unquote, to make the quarterfinals of that tournament. Also helped they got Inferno 3 times, but that jump bug was obviously disruptive to that major. You also see Fnatic possibly, not Fnatic, but FaZe also possibly being dead during this time, because they make the Olaf Meister and Guardian changes after this event, and they're a team who don't make the playoffs of this event. G2, another team that don't make the playoffs of the event, and I think this is the event that sort of puts the nail in the coffin of the Swiss system. I mean, I was critical of the Swiss system going back to the E-League major, Atlanta, but I think this is where you saw so many wacky results because of the lack of seeding and some more other factors with the Swiss, lack of best of threes, where people sort of really start to say, okay, maybe Swiss isn't the best system anymore. But yeah, that issue, the issues with the PGL Major Cracker weren't maybe as intense as others, but I mean, the bug, North also was a team that made a roster change right after the major, another pretty significant team that made a roster change. I guess Na'Vi also made a pretty significant roster change with picking up Zeus. But yeah, this is an event I think that stands out to a lot of people because of the upsets, with Astralis and SK being the only two remaining teams of the top 4 teams at the time that actually make the playoffs, and they meet in the quarterfinals. And then Astralis, once they win, they actually lose to Gambit in sort of a shocking upset in the semifinals. And you have the Immortals Gambit final, which is super surprising, and maybe some people want to put an asterisk next to Gambit winning that because they don't have to beat Astralis, FaZe, G2, and SK. They just have to beat Astralis. So yeah, no, you can say that there's a lot more significant issues than just this Boltz and Phelps issue on SK currently, with say 5 of the 11 majors, Valve majors we have now. But just to close the video, I just want to talk about what I think an asterisk means going forward. So what I think an asterisk should mean, or what I think it normally means, I think a lot of people just want to say if there's a problem in a tournament, you have to put an asterisk by it, but I don't think that's quite right. I think an asterisk is where you have to assign a footnote, have to add a sentence to a result, to a stat, every time you mention the stat. You can't talk about this result, this stat, without mentioning this piece of context, this additional bit of information. You can't talk about, say, Barry Bonds' home run record without also talking about the doping issues, and the same thing with maybe the Lance Armstrong and the Tour de France wins, right? Or those were probably stripped from him, right? But for every tournament, every game, nothing's perfect. There's always formatting issues and maybe some injury issues, especially with, like, say, American football, where there's a lot of players and it's very contact heavy. So there's no team going into, say, the Super Bowl with the perfect full lineup, right? And maybe some players even get injured throughout the course of the Super Bowl game. So yeah, I mean, at some point, some of these issues have to be just context, and you have to just say, okay, there was maybe some suboptimal things, there was some pieces of context, some issues, but you don't maybe have to mention, say, the PGL Major, Krakow, and who won that with mentioning the jump bug. I don't think that is a necessary thing. I think that changed the course of the major, but I don't think it really changed who. It did change it, but maybe Gambit would have still won that, or, it's more like the butterfly effect with that one. It's not like it had a very, very dramatic impact on the finals, and every game Gambit played, Gambit still deserve a lot of that credit. You don't have to bring that up. I think that's sort of the criteria for an asterisk. And if you want to attach an asterisk to every single major, I think it sort of degrades what an asterisk means. It means it's a very different, very dissimilar event where the result has to be sort of disconnected from other results of the same vein and say, hey, this is really different. You have to talk about why it's different. So if every event has an asterisk, I think no event really should have an asterisk, if you know what I mean. If you're saying everything's dissimilar, how dissimilar are they? You know, they're sort of the Incredibles thing, right? But yeah, that's just my basic opinion. I don't think that the Boltz SK issue is as significant as people are trying to make it out to be.